Q1 of 2024, we've kind of kicked off a new program. So we're just starting to get some data and results from this. And going into it, we had chats with about maybe 15, 20 different top SaaS companies, asking them what they were doing for influencer marketing, what was working, how they were attributing it, how they were tracking it, what was actually producing results. So I'll kind of just share all the data that I have, what we're currently doing, and then things I think are also very interesting moving forward that we might invest in or we might look at. So the first thing is, a lot of influencer programs work in kind of just a pay per post or pay per asset format. So standard influencer marketing is like you pay someone $2,000, $3,000, they have a big audience, they make a post for you. The challenge with it, it's very hard to attribute or understand if that type of work is actually driving results, is actually driving business. And unfortunately, it can kind of become a lose-lose, because what happens is company pays the person does the post, it's hard to track, and so then they don't renew. They don't do more with the influencer. So it actually kind of affects the influencer side as well as the brand side, because you very rarely see those relationships lasting for over a year with consistent posting. And the other thing is, we need to take a step back and understand, like, why does influencer marketing work, or where does it work? It's all about trust, right? Influencers are a shortcut to trust. You're taking someone who already has a community, who has established trust, they're translating that trust to that community. But if it's a random one-off, it's very unlikely to build that trust. In fact, people have a little bit of blinders up. They kind of know, okay, influencer marketing is a thing. People are being paid to do stuff. So really what it takes is, over a period of time, having those consistent touch points, not having the one-off, but having the quarterly, hopefully yearly type of relationships. And whenever possible, especially in the B2B SaaS world, also having it come from that place of actual usage, coming up from a place where people are authentically using this tool or system. So when we stood up our program, we actually tried something that was very rare. I don't know other companies that are kind of doing influencer programs like this, but we launched what we call a performance-oriented model. What it means is that there's a compensation that is a blend of a couple different variables. So number one is, you have a blend of cash upfront and cash upon hitting a goal. So you sit down with the influencer and you say, what's our target? Our target is 10 paid accounts during a 3-month period, during a quarterly period is how we structured most of ours. So you say, okay, we're going to do 50% upfront, 50% cash afterwards. And that cash side can be a little bit different, because some people might serve micro solopreneurs, some people might serve really big established enterprise companies. And so you figure out what that number is that makes sense for your business. That cash is that investment to say, hey, look, I know you're going to be building some assets, maybe creating some videos. You're going to be putting in that time and investment. And so we want you to be supported on that. But in addition, there's this financial incentive to hit that goal. On top of that, we layer a pretty generous affiliate program that pays 20 to 30% in perpetuity. So that's big. Like, when you're talking about average accounts that are paying thousands and thousands of dollars, many 5 figures plus over the lifetime of these accounts, getting 30% of that in perpetuity is also a large upside, right? And then for folks that exist on external platforms, like if someone is on in our case, maybe a MailChimp or a HubSpot, we'll also cover that person's account for the duration of the contract and migrate them over. So we make it super easy for the person to actually use the tool firsthand and have that firsthand experience. And so we've kicked this off this quarter. We have a handful of people that are in the program right now, and we're seeing just a lot of really exciting things. I was just sharing briefly right before this call with Ryan how one of the influencers we're working with, even though it's not in their contract, is basically launching an accelerator. And we already have over 20 people in that accelerator who've signed up. Part of signing up for that email accelerator is to open an active campaign trial. And it's so cool to see that dynamic is very different from a standard influencer dynamic, because they're very invested in, how do I make this work? You're not haggling on the cost per asset. You're working with them collaboratively. And so I'm really bullish about that. That's kind of model number one that we're testing. We're going to continue to expand. We're going to continue to iterate. Model number two is, if you are going to go for pay by post, in order to have a better sense of attribution, my recommendation is to choose a time period and choose a niche. So say, instead of just hiring, hey, I'm going to hire one person who serves my B2B market, one person that serves my e-commerce market, here's what I recommend. Go hire 10 influencers, have them post one time per week for a month, and have it all be in the e-commerce space. Then you look, okay, we made this investment of 20, 30 grand or whatever it ends up being, and you look at the changes in sale and traffic for e-commerce as a specific cohort. So what I would do is, if you want to start scrappy, you can just put all the names into Excel. You can put all the posts as they come in, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and you can do it that way. As you get more sophisticated, there's platforms like, there's one called Tagger by Sprout Social that makes it really easy for you to aggregate all the views, so you can see literally all the people that you bring into the program. It'll pull those views from social automatically. And there's a bunch of other cool functionalities on platforms like Tagger where you can look at like who your competitors are paying. Like, I can go on Tagger and I can see who Klaviyo or HubSpot or other top providers in my space in marketing automation, who they're paying. So that's pretty interesting. So that's kind of a second one. If you're going to go pay by post, really try to concentrate it and be able to look at those acute spikes, right? And depending on the type of product or the business, you could also potentially localize that as well, right? Find people in a certain area. So that's kind of the second bucket I would put. The third thing that I would look at is, when we kind of went into this, we talked to a lot of SaaS companies and we asked them, how are you running influencer programs and what's actually working? And we found one really interesting thread across a lot of those. And they said, we have a lot of success when we ask influencers to promote a very specific asset. Like, instead of this whole like blended, like they're doing 10 different things, it's like, we're launching a new podcast, support this podcast, right? Or it could be, support this event that we're hosting. Or we're launching this really big new feature and we want you to just be like hyping, making video content, emailing, but it's all focused around this very specific thing. And then you give them UTMs and you're able to track in that kind of standard way through that, but it's very targeted. And so a lot of the tech platforms that are in our partner ecosystem that we had conversations with, that's where they said they're seeing the biggest impact. They're like, hey, we've experimented, we've spent $200,000 on influencers. This is where we have the most confidence in the actual ROI or return. It's trackable. We can see that. So that's something that we haven't dabbled in heavily, but we're thinking about a lot, because we're about to launch next week a new podcast and we're about to launch a new newsletter as well. So we have these owned assets that we're just about to put out. They're SaaS focused assets, both of them. And so we're really like thinking about, hey, it makes a lot of sense to figure out how we get distribution through the right partners for those assets. So that's definitely something that's top of mind. The fourth bucket I'll talk about is something I'm really interested to continue to study. I've been kind of sharing in public about my work with it so far, but there's a rise of short form video being ranked in search result in SERPs and by top AI providers under, there's like video attribution sections that exist now on platforms like Perplexity and many others. So basically, these tools are going out and they're finding sources for information that they feed up, right? And you want to be listed. You want to be the video that is selected and pulled in, because this is how people are starting to search and find information. So I think there's actually an incredible opportunity for brands to invest in video creators that are going to put together high production value video content across a whole bunch of relevant topics as it relates to brand or common search terms, and it comes from that third-party source. And I was digging into Perplexity and other platforms, like learning about what videos do they elevate, what videos tend to, and I don't have the perfect answers yet, but I found a couple things. Number one, it's recent videos. So it's a push to put out new content. The vast majority of ranking videos are within 12 months. And it's super interesting because you see videos that literally have 1,200 views that are outranking a video with 100,000 views, because that 100,000 view video was 3 years ago. So that part is a very interesting data point. The production value tends to be pretty polished. For a lot of my searches, they have like good quality professional thumbnails. The overall recording of them seems quite solid as well. I don't know if it's that, or if that correlates with like a high engagement signal and it's actually the high engagement signal that's actually prioritized. But again, one of the things I find fascinating is that it doesn't seem like views is a major factor, which is super interesting. Like, there's tons of like, even for major terms, how to convert more trials, how to drive as much revenue from email, like all these things that I'm searching based around these highly competitive terms. And those videos that are being used in attribution have 800 views, 1,500 views, 5,000 views. I mean, these aren't mega videos. So to me, I see there's this shift that is occurring in our market, and there's this tremendous opportunity for us to look at how do we take advantage of that third-party content. And not to go too off the rails or kind of into the weeds, but Google had a hidden gems update. And the Hidden Gems update, one of the things that it did is it prioritizes third-party community content. There's actually a section now when you search a lot of terms that says discussions and forums that will actually show up as a separate section now, right? And underneath that, you see a whole bunch of Reddit threads, you see a whole bunch of Quora threads. And so one of the things that's happening is programmatic SEO is getting flooded with 100x as much content. So the Google algorithm wants to serve out the most relevant information, but they're trying to decide, like, how do we reconcile? How do we deal with this massive influx of content? Well, one of the ways they can do that is by looking at third-party things that have a validation mechanism, meaning that if you have a Reddit thread with 1,000 upvotes, it shows that third-party people have prioritized that content. And sure enough, that content is starting to rank insanely well. As a random example, I write on a whole bunch of different topics on Reddit. When Reddit was going to file its own IPO, Reddit just IPO'd, I wrote a post called like Reddit files their S1 and just broke down what I thought about it. If you go to Reddit files their S1 right now, my post is the #1 result. It drove like 400,000 views. It's ranking #1 within several days, right? And I think actually recently the SEC listing might have actually bumped me to #2, but it just shows the incredible power of that third-party content. So tying this back into influencers, because I'm kind of going through what we're doing and what we're thinking about. That's another thing I'm thinking about. How do we get influencers into these subreddits? How do we get influencers into these third-party sources? So you create that long tail. Because that's the other thing I want to leave people with as well, is when you're thinking about these arrangements, think about what's going to last, what's evergreen. If someone creates like an amazing review where they say like my top tools or something, and that is something that gets a bunch of traffic and that stays up for a long time and they continue to update it, that has like the legacy impact and ability to drive business for you. When I look at our top affiliates, some of the best affiliates, I mean, people literally being paid millions of dollars as affiliates, are people that have super high ranking review sites, right? And so in the same vein, as you see search changing, as you see these gears shifting, I would be thinking about how can we invest in getting quality videos, getting quality reviews. Like a perfect example is we went in and I typed in terms around why should someone use ActiveCampaign versus HubSpot? Why should someone use ActiveCampaign versus MailChimp? And there's a bunch of videos that were created comparing those tools. And so it's fascinating to go in and look at those. It's like, well, I'm not asking the question one way or another. I'm just asking the question. So if that first video that pops up is pro AC or it's pro our competitor, that's a huge difference, right? That's the first thing that someone's going to read. And so being able to potentially invest in those key areas, whether that's with competitors or around topical bits, I think is hugely valuable. So that's just a little bit at a high level. I know kind of walk through that quickly, but those are some of the major buckets for folks that I would personally be thinking about, and happy to answer questions or speak to if anyone wants to get into the nuance of either of those four. Most brands, when they're paying influencers, are trying to drive direct business. So if that's not your focus, if you're just like really investing in brand awareness and you're cool to say like, I'm going to pay this person $2,000, and if they get 50,000 views on that post, that's a win. Cool, that works, that's fine. I just find that's not what most brands expect. So if most brands expect like, I want to drive 5 sales from this post, but then you're just paying an influencer, you have no assurances about the actual performance of that post, right? Like very rarely, I sat down with an influencer agency and I said, do any of these influencers provide guarantees of views? So like, let's just talk just about views and say, look, like we're going to give you 100,000 views, right? Like, because a lot of times they'll say, oh, my average post gets, let's just use 100,000 as an example. My average post gets 100,000. But what if that post gets 4,000? Right? Like most influencers, you just pay and they post. And if that gets 4,000, then like, that's your fault. Right? So that's also interesting. Like I would be curious if there would be folks who would be willing to be like, no, yeah, we'll insure 100. If we don't get 100,000 on the first post, we'll do a second, we'll do a third post. Like we'll make sure we get to that mark. I think that the value there, if done consistently over time, I think can provide some brand awareness and some trust. So I don't think people should rule that off, but I would be very, very careful. Brands who are starting out, especially startups, are going to be tight on budget. They're going to have to be very smart with how they allocate that. And so if you're not in a position to do that in a sustainable way over time and you don't have the right signals, I think 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a losing scenario. Because again, as I kind of shared in my talk, like I've talked with a lot of people that have paid for posts. We have paid for posts at Active Campaign. And the challenge is it seems like it always goes the same way. People do it 1, 2, maybe 3 times, and then they stop. And they stop because it's like they don't know. They're like, oh, we generated 50,000 views, 100,000 views, but like we don't really see any major signal. Maybe we try to use direct attribution and ask, how did you hear about us? But we're not really seeing a bunch of people name the influencer. And ultimately, they're kind of like, we don't know. And it's kind of that shrug motion. So for folks that are considering it, that would be my recommendation. Be very clear on your goals. Be very clear what success looks like. And if you're a startup, this is a whole nother bundle of conversation. But if you're a startup, I'd be very careful about brand awareness paid investments in that capacity. Meaning that I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying that you should not invest in your brand. Your brand itself is how people perceive you. It's your visuals on your site. It's how you communicate. It's your customer experience. All of that's super important. You should invest in that. When I say brand awareness investments, I'm talking about like a CPM perspective where you're just trying to associate like your product with a category. So when I think about that, when I think about like brand investments with like Active Campaign, it's like when people think of marketing automation, when they think of email marketing, I want to be one of the first 3 tools that come to their mind. I want to be on that short list. That is the kind of the work of a brand awareness campaign in my opinion. The challenge with that though is when you're going up against billion-dollar companies, right? Like you're a new incumbent coming into the market and you're going to try to be on that top list above, like in my space, above a HubSpot, above a MailChimp, above an Active Campaign. That's going to be a slog, right? So I think that I would instead use that budget in a different spot, a more creative spot. And this is where it would shift our conversation to like, can they make quality videos that can have that long tail evergreen impact and can kind of be something that you can build with, right? Can they create assets? If you're trying to launch a show that you want to stand out, can you get a bunch of those influencers to promote that and give that a bunch of velocity where otherwise might have gotten lost in the weeds? That's where I would be thinking about allocating my budget.
And one next question was just about finding these influencers in the first place. So have you got any recommendations on where to find influencers and how to vet them? Because not all influencers are created equal, right? What do you look for? What are some things that you would look for that you tend to associate with like, this is probably a good indication this influencer is going to drive a lot and this influencer maybe not so much? Like,
yeah,
two-part
yeah,
question.
it's a great question. So a couple ways we look at it. Like the first thing, to be candid with you, is I work for my network, right? Like I have a pretty broad network in B2B and SaaS, and that's one of the markets we serve, especially SMB SaaS. And so that's kind of one of the spots we started. I started with people I know, that I trust, that I know produce good content, and had those conversations with them, just talk about like, hey, is this something that would be interesting to you? Would it be valuable to your audience, et cetera? So I think that if you have a network that is in your ICP, or maybe you have someone at the company, like maybe the founder has that network, I would maybe start with trying to tap there. The next thing is, I think it's really important to do reference checks. So especially anyone that has a media kit, talk to people that have worked with them. Talk with anyone like, and I want to be clear here, I don't think you need to work with people that only with people that have media kits. Sometimes I actually prefer people that don't have media kits because it's easier for me to paint like we have a little bit of a different vision here. So I don't want people to be limited by that. But if people have taken sponsorships before and they can't give you a single reference, that's a red flag, right? Like you should be able to pass me to someone, right? And so I think that is another thing I would be considering. Outside of that, there's a lot of tools that help you search in kind of that conventional influencer angle. So if you're going for like that pay per post model, like the second bucket that I talked about when I talked about clustering and doing a whole bunch of similar influencers that are posting about the same kind of topics during a concentrated period of time, something like Tagger can work well. Now, Tagger is like pretty expensive. I don't know how it varies across the board, but it's like $1,000 a month plus when we were looking at it. So I think that there's probably more accessible options. I think a lot of this depends on the scale of what your scale is as an organization. But that's one path. I just would be a little bit cautious. The thing to caution on that area is that it's going to serve you up a very specific type of influencer, and that is someone who's used to being paid for posts, right? So it doesn't mean that that person necessarily won't be valuable, but it's going to be a certain type of person. So another thing that you can be doing outside of your own network is trying to find those specialists. Like my network is B2B SaaS primarily. The vast majority of people are marketing leaders, partner leaders, founders, and execs in that world. But I know people outside that are e-commerce experts. I know people outside that are top creators. I know people in these other verticals. So I would go to them. I would go to the people that I know that are experts, and I would say, look, at like, we're trying to find some quality creators. Who do you really have a lot of confidence in their quality? I wouldn't even just ask like who's an influencer or who's like paid. It would just be like who has the best content, who has content that is super valuable and super rich. Like that's the person I want to talk to. And the other thing I would say is that oftentimes, especially with people that don't have media packages, figuring out that bundling can be a little bit of an art with them. And so work collaboratively to find that. Like we at Active Campaign took a fairly structured approach because as a large organization, we're kind of trying to build those systems. But also, I have the data point. One of our most successful partnerships at my last company, which was also a B2B SaaS, but was much smaller, 25-person company, we had an influencer that drove us 500 plus sales. I mean, it's crazy. Like it was super, super successful. And when we were working on that partnership, the way that we structured it is like, we basically they basically said, hey, like we could do this for like X price point. Instead of haggling on the price point, which was fairly high, especially as a startup, that point was fairly high. But we went back, sat as an executive team, and we got creative. We're like, what else could this person do that would be valuable for us? So instead of pushing back and being like that price, like we'd have to cut that in half, we said, okay, yeah, we'll do that. But in addition, we're going to need this video asset. We're also going to need a promotion here. Could you mention us on stage right here? And we expanded it. And the thing is, like with these influencers, especially if they kind of come in with the fact they think you might be trying to negotiate or there's that back and forth, if you come to meet them on the price, they see that jangling right in front of them and they want to take that. And so they're willing to potentially like press more. And so what that ends up happening is you might get 2x the value that you would have. Like if you were to pay for that independently, or if you had come in with that, you might have had to pay twice as much as where you settle because you accept their price, right? So just another thing, you need to be very selective. Like you need to be the right person. In this case, it was like a very high profile creator, like mega creator. And so like we knew the network was there. We knew the audience was there. We had been on this person's podcast, and just being on their podcast had driven a big spike in sales, which is rare. Like whole other conversation, but I do a lot of work in podcasting, and it's very much like a saturation effect. You want to hop on a lot of shows in the same area. Over time, you start to see those small lifts, but it's definitely not like podcast went live, I got 100 sales. Like that is very uncommon. So if you get on a show that's that big that you hop on and you're seeing like your Google Analytics spike up, like, okay, that's probably a person you know has a really relevant audience fit. So very long-winded answer, but hopefully that covers some of what you're asking. There's kind of this idea of demand creation and demand conversion, right? So if you have a lot of existing intent, then running a lot of PPC ads can work well to take people who are interested. They then see an ad, they're like, oh yeah, I need an email tool. Boom, I'm going to go buy. I don't find that ads are very good at demand creation, meaning seeding the interest in the first place. Influencers sit more in that camp. These are people that have trust, it's established. And if that person brings something up, I mean, you can look, there's so many examples of this in both B2B and B2C, but like one of the most kind of laughable examples is like you take these mega podcasts like Joe Rogan and Huberman, they bring up some random supplement or ice baths or saunas. They're literally taking $1 million businesses and turning them into $50 million businesses because all of these people suddenly have never thought about sauna in their lives, but because Joe Rogan said it, they're going and spending 10 grand to go buy it and put it in their backyard. So I think that potential to see that is very powerful. And even in B2B, there's a lot of people who like omnichannel marketing. They might not be familiar what even omnichannel marketing means, right? But all these people want more leads. Everyone wants more closed business. And if you're able to have a point of trust that talks about it, I think that's valuable. Getting to your specific question on cost point, super variable, right? For a couple of reasons. So number one is how expensive is your service, right? Like what is a win for you can be really variable depending on a lot of factors. I mean, a lot of people who are doing pay per post, right, are starting, again, I'm like trying to think of a way to make this as valuable and as relatable as possible. Because I know people that have paid $300 for a post, $500 for a post. I know people that have paid all the way up to $3,000 for a single post for someone who has 250,000 followers or some sort of big network. So it hugely depends on the audience, right? What I would strongly encourage folks to do who want to go for a pay per post, and hopefully we've kind of painted the potential pitfalls of that. And hopefully we've also painted that there is the ability to have more performance-oriented models if that's something you want to do. But say people are maybe a little bit lazy and they're like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to pay people for posts and we'll see what happens. Then what I would do is I would say, hey, we're going to invest $4,000 for $1,000 per post, and we're going to do it over the course of a month. And we're going to have you pay one post every single week. We're going to pay you $1,000 for that post. We're going to pay you $4,000 over the course of this month. Meaning that I would not do a single pay for single post. I would make sure if you're going to commit to that strategy, at the very least, have it go for several weeks or some longer term period, so you have chance to have that multi-touch. I am highly, highly skeptical that any kind of like single post strategy will drive a ton of bandwidth for you. The other thing I'll say here too is, another thing we haven't talked about at all is how much leeway you give these people. How much are you kind of coming in with a brief and saying like, post this thing versus letting them post? Like, I err on the extreme in this one of like almost no brief, right? And there's a lot of debate, and I'm not saying necessarily I'm right, but I choose people that I trust and have confidence in with their aptitude and their experiences. And especially in the case of this, where I'm getting them to use the product. I'm like, I don't want to tell them what to talk. You talk about what's working for you, what's interesting. Maybe it's a CRM, maybe it's this email feature. Like, I want to equip them to use this tool, and then based on that tool, share their experience. Hey, it was really cool. We migrated from this tool, and now we can do X, Y, Z. Or hey, I just learned this new thing. If we did this, we increased our click through by X%. Like, that's the kind of stuff I want. I don't want to come in there with a brief and just have someone that just doesn't come across as authentic. And almost everyone who does that, they end up getting these really stale videos that just don't, like, person's like reading a script, right? And they're like, this tool is so great at solving for this problem. And then people are just like, okay, that's just like nonsense, right? Like, that has no persuasive power at all. So that would be the way I would think about that. And in terms of cost point, the best advice I can give you is to try to talk to them. Like, if you're going into someone, try to find people that have either worked with that person before. We talked about reference. So get the numbers from them, like ask them, what did you spend? And like, hopefully those people are willing to share with that, and you can get a sense of, is that, and you can also test others in the market. So if you're thinking of working with an influencer, talk to 3 of them that have similar types of audiences in a similar vertical, and get a sense of like, what do those pricing look like? And if one of them is like, we could do it 2,000, one of them says we could do it 3,000, one of them comes in at 12,000. Okay, you kind of know the outlier. Like, okay, this one probably, like, follower count is the same, audience engagement is the same, but they're just charging 5x. Like, that probably doesn't make sense. But again, if you go with a performance-oriented model, you solve for a lot of these problems, because there's that mutual incentive that you've built in with them of saying like, hey, we're going to go get an account sold goal together, right? And so again, that is, if you can pull that off, in my opinion, one of the best ways that you essentially can structure it. So would encourage folks to go for a performance model wherever they have capacity. And for folks, I think one of the things when I bring this up is a lot of people are just like skeptical that influencers will do it. They're like, I just don't think that people, and I'm like, go try and find people who aren't like a conventional influencer, but are just trusted people in your field. Start there. Like, find people in your network who maybe have never done a single influencer deal, but are trusted, and you know they have quality content, and have that conversation and say like, how do we work out a win-win? Because you might find that those types of people, like I personally have never done an influencer deal, but I produce millions and millions of impressions in this vertical. And if someone came to me and the price point was right, and they said, hey, Casey, I'm really worried about just having impressions, would you commit to a goal of saying like, we're gonna guarantee 50,000 views, whether that's one post or 5? I'd probably do that. I don't see why not. Like, that's part of creating like the win-win scenario with those people. So I think part of this is influencer marketing is very new. Very few people have it figured out and dialed in B2B. A lot of people who kind of claim to have it dialed don't really have it dialed. Like, I'm giving information about signals, but hopefully people can see I'm being totally transparent. Like, we've only been doing this for 1 quarter like this. So everything is new. Data is new. We're just starting to see where things go. So we obviously have signals. We have things that are encouraging, like, oh, this seems to be working. Oh, this is really cool that this person is willing to do this or that. But over time, we're going to continue to learn. We're going to continue to adapt and change those models. And so I think that is part of the game.
Thanks,
One
Casey.
more question, and guys, if anyone has wants to jump in with some more questions, feel free to do so. We got you for a little bit longer, Casey. One question that someone did want me to ask you was, what do you need on your side before, like as a business, what do you need on your side before you should go out approaching influencers? Like, so you mentioned someone at the company having a network, whether it's you or the CEO or someone else, starting with that network first is absolutely important if you've got that as a starting point. But do you need, like, should you have optimized the hell out of your landing pages first before you go approaching influencers? Or do you need a bunch of content or a bunch of assets or a bunch of something for them to work with first? Like what do you need organized at your end to make this whole process so much more streamlined?
Yeah, for sure. So it's kind of a multifaceted answer. The first thing, and we kind of talked about a couple aspects of this, but like you need to have very clear like plan and goal organization. That's one piece. So you just need to know like what does a win look like? This is true of any growth experiment that you run as an organization. Like make sure that is clearly defined. I know that might seem like table stakes, but I can tell you I work with a lot of companies. It is not. Like people invest in these things and it's very unclear how they're monitoring, and different departments have different ideas of what success looks like. And the marketing team is like, this is amazing. We generated 100 leads. And then, you know, the CFO is like, I don't care about that. Like, where's the revenue? We like, this is about revenue. Like, well, where's our ROI? So just putting that out there, like get aligned first off. I think the next steps in terms of like what you need prepared, obviously, if you have landing pages, like you need to be thinking about where you're sending people. This kind of goes into sending people to specialized assets being really effective. In some ways that kind of makes sense, like driving someone to your new YouTube or your podcast or something is like kind of a very specialized thing. I would absolutely be very careful about sending people to a generic homepage, right? Especially like for a company like Active Campaign, like where we serve so many different markets, like it's going to be really tough for people to identify. So wherever possible, think about that. Think about what kind of assets would produce the most return for you and are most optimized for that specific vertical. I think that definitely makes sense. If you're starting out again and you have the capacity, like if there's something you're trying to stand up, a new show, a new like that I think is a good idea. I'm looking forward to experimenting more and having more firsthand data I can share with you. But I can tell you that many top SaaS brands that I've spoken with, who I trust, the leaders within those organizations, have told me that's where they're getting a lot of return. So that would be potentially an area that would solve for that piece. I think really, like so many things, like AI across the board, you want to get into it for the right reasons is really the major thing. Like, don't go do a bunch of influencer marketing because you're like, everyone's talking about influencer marketing. I'm going to get left behind if I'm not doing influencer marketing. Like that is a bad reason to start. You want to go to influencer marketing if you think there's people that exist that talk to my network, that are trusted. They have established trust, and I think that they could produce meaningful content that could tie in with our product and have that be able to drive demand. Like I think that is the focal point you want to come from.
And final question for me, Casey, is there anything that you wish more people knew about going in and doing influencer marketing campaigns, or something that maybe you wish you knew, when you first started getting into this stuff? Is there anything that's a bit counterintuitive, anything that's really kind of surprised you that maybe not enough people know about?
Yeah, I think really this is kind of like somewhat of a generic answer, unfortunately, but I would strongly encourage people just test your offering. Test your offering because oftentimes your assumptions might be wrong. I'll give you an example for ours. When we first launched this program, the first two influencers that we brought into our program, we paid cash side 100% of cash side up front. And then we thought, hey, this doesn't, like, the whole thing is try to align incentives. Like, what if we did 50-50? And we're like, well, shoot, if we do 50-50, people might just say no. Not a single person that we ever proposed that to ever pushed back on the 50-50 split. And we're like, wow, we're dummies. Like we talked to a dozen more people, not a single one ever said don't do that. And so the reason I share that story is because part of this is you just need to have a little bit of experimentation. This is a new muscle. You don't know exactly like what you're going to be setting up. And so don't operate in a box, right? In a box where you're like, oh, people would only accept, or oh, this person asked for 8,000, right? Like we can't get close to that. Like I've had many scenarios like that, and actually we can by creating that bundled approach. Because we're like, hey, we're going to pay you cash, but we're also going to give you affiliate commissions. We're also going to be giving you an account credit, and we can get to that number, right? But we're doing it in a way that's more performance and more like aligned incentives. And so I think that is my biggest thing. If you're going into this, like be flexible, try different approaches. And then I guess connected to that, I already mentioned this, but try to work with them too, though, to make that mutual win. Meaning if the influencer wants a certain dollar amount, I'm not saying you can always get there. Sometimes you might not be able to get there. But if you can have them layer in an extra 5 things that are super valuable, they get the money that they wanted, you get a lot more of the promotional pieces that you need, maybe you can spin up that ends up being a win-win. So that's what I'd say from a very a broad view. And then I guess the other thing I would underscore as well is like encourage folks to see how search and discovery is changing, and encourage folks to think about third-party communities, encourage folks to think about short-form video and the ways that people are consuming information. And if you can be tied into that, I think that's very powerful.